It wasn't exactly the kind of thing you expect to happen over Sunday brunch. A vibrator bouncing out of your designer bag right there in front of your stepson. But there it was, nestled between the artisanal breadsticks and the fancy sea salt grinder. Its blush pink surface winked in the sunlight like some illicit gem. And there he was, Ethan, his blue eyes laser focused on it, a smirk playing on his lips that could only be described as a blend of shock and pure amusement. Inside, I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. Richard, my husband, was completely lost in some rant about venture capital, refilling his wine glass, blissfully unaware. But Ethan saw it. Oh, he definitely saw it. Instead of pretending it vanished into thin air like any normal person would, he leaned forward, his voice smooth but with a definite tease. Claire, he drawled, eyebrows raised high. You dropped something. I froze, my face burning hotter than the avocado toast on my plate. My hands fumbled, snatching the thing off the table and shoving it back into my purse like it was a live grenade. It's, nothing. I stammered, my voice cracking, avoiding his gaze like it was Medusa. Didn't look like nothing, he countered, a slow, sly smile spreading across his face. The nerve of this kid. I shot him a glare that could curdle milk, hoping to shut him down right there, but the damage was done. He'd seen it, and I couldn't unsee the way his expression lingered. Curious, playful, and something else. Something I couldn't quite name. Richard, bless his oblivious heart, just kept droning on about market trends while I busied myself clearing plates that weren't even close to empty and refilling water glasses that were already full to the brim. Anything to escape the suffocating wave of mortification. Later that night, after everyone had retreated to their corners of our Upper West Side brownstone, I found myself in the kitchen, scrubbing the granite countertops like I could scrub away the memory of the brunch disaster. Then Ethan's voice cut through the silence. Hey, he said, leaning casually against the doorframe, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim hallway light. I jumped, dropping the sponge back into the sink with a splash. Then I managed, trying to sound composed. Shouldn't you be in bed? He smirked, a flash of white teeth in the dim light. Could say the same to you. The air between us felt thick, charged with something unspoken, something electric. He stepped fully into the kitchen, his eyes locking onto mine. Look, I didn't mean to embarrass you earlier, he said, his tone softer now, almost intimate. I just wasn't expecting that. I let out a nervous, shaky laugh, avoiding his gaze as I grabbed a dish towel and pretended to dry my hands for the 10th time. It was a mistake. A stupid mistake. Was it? He asked, his voice dropping lower, more serious, sending a shiver down my spine. I finally looked up at him, and for the first time I really noticed the intensity in his gaze. He wasn't teasing anymore. There was something deeper there, something that made my stomach do a nervous flip-flop. I didn't have an answer for him, not one I was ready to admit out loud anyway. Good night, Ethan, I said firmly, brushing past him and practically fleeing to my bedroom. But even as I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had a sinking feeling that nothing about this was going to be simple. And I was right. That night was the moment everything started to unravel. I tried desperately to bury the brunch incident in the deepest recesses of my mind. It was a fluke, an accident, something I was determined to erase. Life needed to go back to normal, and I convinced myself that if I acted like nothing had happened, Ethan would too. For a few days, it almost worked. Richard remained lost in his world of finance, spending most evenings locked away in his home office, crunching numbers. Ethan played his usual role, polite, helpful, occasionally charming in that effortlessly cool way he had. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. I started noticing Ethan more than I should have. The way he moved through the apartment, his easy confidence, the subtle scent of his cologne that lingered in the hallway long after he'd passed. It was subtle at first, these little things, but they chipped away at my carefully constructed denial. I started to see how different he was from his father. Ethan was all raw energy, vibrant and alive, while Richard seemed to have aged 10 years in our marriage. Then came the moment I couldn't ignore, the moment that shattered the illusion of normalcy. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the apartment was unusually quiet. Richard had gone to play golf with a client, and I was aimlessly rearranging the books on the living room shelves, a task I used more for distraction than actual organization. Ethan wandered in, barefoot and shirtless, a basketball tucked under one arm. Hey, he said casually, dropping onto the plush velvet couch, his skin slightly damp from the summer heat, his basketball shorts hanging low on his hips. "Hi," I replied, keeping my eyes glued to the book in my hand, feeling my pulse quicken but forcing myself to focus on the worn spine of the novel. "Where's your shirt?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. He grinned, tossing the basketball onto the floor with a soft thud. "Too hot. Don't worry, I'm not breaking any dress code rules." "You're definitely breaking some kind of rule," I muttered under my breath, but he heard me and chuckled. "You know," he said after a pause, leaning back against the cushions, "I've been meaning to ask you something." I placed the book on the shelf and turned to face him cautiously. "What is it?" "About the other night," he said, his tone suddenly soft but deliberate, sending a jolt of apprehension through me. My stomach dropped. "Ethan, I'm really not trying to make things weird," I started, but he interrupted, holding up his hands as if to calm me. I can't stop thinking about it, about you." My heart pounded in my chest like a trapped bird. "We're not having this conversation," I said quickly, but my voice betrayed me, trembling at the edges. "Why not?" he asked, his blue eyes locked on mine, intense and unwavering. "It's not like I'm imagining things, Claire. I know you feel it too." "Feel what?" I snapped, desperate to regain control of the situation, to shut this down before it went any further. "This," he said simply, gesturing between us, a simple yet devastatingly effective gesture. I turned away, grabbing another book off the pile, pretending to be engrossed in the title, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the words. "You're reading way too much into this. I'm your stepmother, Ethan." "You're not my mother," he said sharply, his voice suddenly cold, cutting through the air like a shard of ice. I froze, the weight of his words sinking in, heavy and undeniable. He wasn't wrong, and we both knew it. I had married his father barely 2 years ago, long after Ethan had grown up and moved out. Our relationship had always been more polite acquaintance than familial bond, and now it was something else entirely, something dangerous. I can't do this," I whispered, not even sure if I was speaking to him or to myself. "This is wrong." "Why?" he challenged, standing up and closing the distance between us, his presence suddenly overwhelming, filling the small space between the couch and the bookshelf. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the raw energy that crackled around him. "Because it just is," I said, my voice faltering, my carefully constructed defenses crumbling around me. He studied me for a long, silent moment, his gaze searching mine, probing, relentless. "You can tell yourself that all you want," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "but it doesn't change the truth." Before I could respond, before I could find the words to deny him, to deny myself, he turned and left the room, leaving me standing there, heart racing, thoughts spinning, the weight of unspoken desires hanging heavy in the air. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and denial. I threw myself into work, taking on a massive new interior design project for a trendy boutique in Soho, hoping to drown myself in fabric swatches and mood boards. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough to keep my mind off Ethan. I started leaving the apartment more often, running errands I didn't actually need to run, just to escape the charged atmosphere that had settled between us like a thick fog. But Ethan wasn't giving up. He was persistent, relentless in his subtle pursuit. One evening, I came home late from a client meeting to find him in the kitchen, cooking dinner. The mouth-watering aroma of garlic and rosemary filled the air, and he looked completely at ease, standing barefoot in front of the stove, stirring something in a pan. "Thought I'd make something for us," he said without looking up, his voice casual, too casual. "Where's Richard?" I asked, setting my bag on the kitchen island, trying to keep my voice even. "Still at the office," he replied, not missing a beat. "Said he'd be late." "Great," I muttered, just the two of us, alone in the apartment. I hesitated, unsure whether to stay or retreat to the supposed safety of my bedroom. But before I could make a decision, Ethan turned to face me, holding out a glass of red wine. "Relax," he said, his voice calm, disarming, his blue eyes holding mine captive. "It's just dinner." Reluctantly, I took the glass, the cool stem a stark contrast to my suddenly clammy hand, and sat down at the kitchen island, watching him move around the kitchen with a grace and confidence that both intimidated and fascinated me. We ate together in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of silverware against porcelain and the occasional hum of soft jazz from his phone. But even in the quiet, the tension was palpable, a thick, unspoken dialogue hanging in the air between us. After dinner, I stood to clear the plates, desperate to break the silence, to find something, anything, to distract myself. But Ethan stopped me, placing a hand gently on my wrist, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through my veins. "Leave it," he said, his voice low, husky. I froze, his touch searing my skin, his gaze burning into mine. "You don't have to run from this, Claire," he said, his eyes searching mine, probing, demanding honesty. "I'm not running," I lied, pulling my hand away, the lie feeling brittle and hollow even to my own ears. "Yes, you are," he said softly, his voice laced with a knowing sadness. "And you're going to keep running until you admit what you want." I opened my mouth to argue, to deny him, to deny myself, but no words came out. He was right. I had been running. Running from him. Running from myself. Running from the undeniable, terrifying truth that had been growing between us, slowly, inexorably since that night at the brunch table. But admitting it, acknowledging it, was too dangerous, too forbidden. Without another word, I turned and fled the kitchen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I locked myself in my bedroom, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath, trying to quiet the storm raging inside me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that Ethan wasn't going to let me go so easily. And deep down, a terrifying, exhilarating part of me wasn't sure I wanted him to. A week passed, and the tension between Ethan and me felt like a taut wire, stretched tighter and tighter, fraying just enough to make me wonder when it might finally snap. I avoided him as much as humanly possible, retreating to my bedroom whenever he was in the common areas, pretending to be absorbed in work or phone calls. But the apartment wasn't big enough to keep our worlds from colliding forever. It was a Friday night when everything finally came to a head. Richard had flown to Chicago for a business trip and wouldn't be back until Sunday evening, leaving Ethan and me alone in the sprawling, silent apartment. I told myself it didn't matter, that I could handle being in the same space as him without losing my carefully constructed composure. But that night proved just how wrong I was. I poured myself a generous glass of Cabernet Sauvignon and settled on the couch, flipping through channels, trying to quiet the restless thoughts swirling in my mind. The apartment was dark and still, the only light the flickering glow of the television screen. Halfway through a forgettable rom-com, I heard footsteps approaching. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his hair slightly mussed, a faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. He was dressed casually in sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt, but there was something about the way he carried himself, so relaxed yet deliberate, that made my pulse quicken. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, keeping my tone deliberately neutral, pretending to be engrossed in the movie. "Not really," he replied, stepping fully into the living room, his gaze fixed on me. "You?" I held up my wineglass, a flimsy shield. "This helps." He chuckled softly, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the quiet room, and walked over to sit beside me on the couch. Too close. Way too close. Close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that his knee brushed against mine. My heart thudded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat, but I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, pretending not to notice, pretending it didn't matter. "What are you watching?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, a velvet caress in the darkness. "Casablanca," I mumbled, the iconic scene of Rick and Ilsa's bittersweet goodbye unfolding on the screen, a painful irony not lost on me. Just an old classic. I took a long sip of wine, trying to steady my nerves, trying to create a buffer between us. He leaned back, stretching his arm along the back of the couch, his fingers almost, but not quite, grazing my shoulder. The casual intimacy of the gesture sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine. "I've never seen it," he confessed, his gaze still fixed on the television. "You should," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's complicated, but beautiful." For a long, breathless moment, we sat in silence, the movie playing on, the dialogue fading into the background. Irrelevant. I couldn't focus on the screen, couldn't concentrate on anything but the charged silence, the palpable tension crackling between us like static electricity. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me, dissecting me. Finally, I turned to him, intending to say something, anything, to break the spell, to diffuse the unbearable pressure, but the words died on my lips before they could form. He was so close, his face inches from mine, his expression unreadable, yet intensely focused. And then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, a breath against my skin. "You're beautiful, Claire." The room seemed to tilt, the world spinning slightly off its axis. I laughed nervously, shaking my head, a weak, dismissive gesture. Ethan, don't. I mean it, he interrupted, his gaze never wavering, his blue eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that stole my breath. I don't think you hear it enough. You deserve to hear it. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry, constricted. You shouldn't say things like that, I managed, my voice shaky, barely audible. Why not? He asked, leaning even closer, bridging the remaining gap between us, his breath warm on my face. Because, my voice faltered, the carefully constructed walls of denial crumbling around me as I searched desperately for a reason, for an explanation, for anything to push him away. But the truth was, I didn't have one, at least not one that felt honest. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, before my rational mind could scream louder than my reckless heart, I stood abruptly, clutching my wine glass like a lifeline, a fragile barrier between us. I should go to bed, I said, my voice trembling, betraying the turmoil raging within me. But as I turned to leave, to escape the suffocating pull of his presence, Ethan caught my wrist, his touch firm but gentle, a silent plea. Claire, wait. I froze, unable to look at him, unable to face the truth reflected in his eyes. Please, I whispered, my voice laced with desperation. Don't make this harder than it already is. Look at me, he said softly, his voice a low murmur against my ear. Against my better judgment, against every fiber of my being that screamed danger, I turned back. And the vulnerability in his eyes, the raw, unguarded longing that mirrored my own forbidden desires, undid me completely. In that moment, the world seemed to stand still. The only sound, the faint hum of the television, the only reality, the heat of his gaze, the silent question hanging in the air between us. And then, as if pulled by some invisible, irresistible force, I found myself leaning in. The first brush of his lips against mine was tentative, hesitant, a question rather than a statement. But it sent a shockwave through me, a jolt of pure electricity that ignited every nerve ending in my body. I should have stopped it. I should have pulled away, broken the connection, retreated to safety. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself sink into the kiss, the taste of him intoxicating, forbidden, addictive. When we finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, my mind was racing, a whirlwind of 1,000 reasons why this was a catastrophic mistake. But when I met his gaze, all I could see was the raw, unguarded longing reflected back at me. Tell me you don't want this, he said, his voice barely audible, a desperate plea. And for the first time, I couldn't lie. I couldn't deny the truth that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks, threatening to boil over. I couldn't deny the undeniable pull of desire, the dangerous thrill of the forbidden. I couldn't. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window, the events of the night before replaying in my mind like a film reel, a vivid, intoxicating, and terrifying film reel I couldn't pause or rewind. A torrent of emotions washed over me, shame, exhilaration, and a deep, gnawing fear of what came next. I tried to rationalize it, to minimize it, to tell myself it had been a one-time lapse, a moment of weakness, a drunken mistake that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, a treacherous voice whispered the truth. I knew better. The way he touched me, the way he looked at me, the way he'd made me feel alive again. After years of quiet desperation, it was like a drug. And I was already addicted. Sure enough, it didn't end there. It couldn't end there. Over the next few weeks, we found ways to be alone, stealing moments when Richard was out of the apartment, or lost in his work, or simply oblivious. The secrecy of it all only heightened the intensity, adding a dangerous edge to every glance, every stolen touch, every hushed conversation. Each encounter felt electric, charged with the thrill of the forbidden, the risk of discovery. One evening, after Richard had left for yet another business trip, Ethan and I ended up at a seedy motel on the outskirts of the city, a place so nondescript it practically screamed anonymity. It was the kind of place people went to disappear, to shed their identities, to indulge in desires they couldn't acknowledge in the light of day. As we lay tangled together in the dimly lit room, the cheap motel art casting grotesque shadows on the walls, the weight of what we were doing, the sheer recklessness of it all, pressed down on me like a physical burden. We can't keep doing this, I murmured, my fingers tracing the sharp angle of his jawline, the familiar comfort of his skin a stark contrast to the chaos raging within me. We don't have to stop, he said, his voice steady, resolute, his blue eyes burning into mine. We just have to be careful. Careful? The word felt like a cruel joke. a pathetic attempt at self-deception. No matter how cautious we were, no matter how many precautions we took, the truth was a ticking time bomb. And I had no idea when or how spectacularly it might explode. The fallout began sooner than I expected, and from an unexpected source. One afternoon, I was working on a new design project, a lucrative renovation for a wealthy client named Roger Sterling. He owned a string of high-end properties across Manhattan, and he was, to put it mildly, trouble. Charming, yes, in a predatory, old money kind of way, but also overbearing, entitled, the kind of man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted and who didn't take no for an answer. As I walked him through the initial plans for his latest penthouse renovation, his flirtations, which had been subtle at first, became increasingly overt, more insistent. "You have an eye for detail, Claire," he purred, his gaze lingering on me longer than it should have, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "I can see why Richard married you." I forced a polite, professional smile, ignoring the unease that prickled at the back of my neck, the warning bells clanging in my head, but the tension escalated when he brushed against me, his hand lingering a beat too long on my waist, his touch possessive, unsettling. "Roger, please," I said, stepping away, creating some much-needed distance between us. He smirked, as if amused by my mild resistance, his eyes raking over me in a way that made my skin crawl. "Come on, Claire," he drawled, his voice low and suggestive. "Don't act like you don't enjoy the attention." The encounter left me rattled, shaken to my core, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Roger Sterling wasn't going to let things go so easily. Meanwhile, Ethan's ex-girlfriend, a sleek, blonde socialite named Tiffany, had started coming around more often, her presence a constant, unwelcome reminder of the messy web I was weaving. She was sweet on the surface, all smiles and polite inquiries, but there was a sharpness to her, a calculating glint in her eyes that put me on edge. One evening, as I passed by Ethan's room, heading to the kitchen for a late-night tea, I overheard her voice, low and sultry, drifting through the slightly ajar door. "You've been different lately, Ethan," she cooed, her tone laced with suspicion. "Distracted. Is there someone else?" I didn't hear Ethan's response, but the knot in my stomach tightened, twisting with a cold dread. Tiffany was no fool. She was sharp, perceptive, and the thought of her discovering our secret, even suspecting it, sent a wave of icy panic through me. By the time Richard returned from his Chicago trip, the cracks in our carefully constructed facade had begun to widen, to splinter. He noticed my distracted demeanor, the dark circles under my eyes, the forced cheerfulness that didn't quite reach my eyes. He questioned my late nights, my sudden, fervent interest in working outside the apartment, my increasingly erratic behavior. "Is everything okay, Claire?" he asked one evening, his voice unusually gentle, as we sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy and strained. "Of course," I lied, forcing a smile, a brittle, desperate smile that felt like it might shatter at any moment, but the truth was, everything was far from okay. The web of lies I'd spun was growing more tangled, more suffocating by the day, and I had no idea how much longer I could keep it from unraveling completely. The secrecy that had once felt exhilarating, a dangerous thrill, now became suffocating, a constant weight pressing down on me. Every stolen glance with Ethan, every hushed conversation behind closed doors, every clandestine rendezvous at that dingy motel felt like another tick of the clock, another step closer to inevitable exposure. It wasn't just the guilt. I could, twisted as it sounds, almost live with the guilt, but the growing fear of being discovered, the constant anxiety of waiting for the other shoe to drop, that was slowly, relentlessly eating me alive. And it didn't help that Ethan, emboldened by our secret, was becoming bolder, less cautious. One morning, I walked into the kitchen to find him leaning against the counter, sipping coffee, looking infuriatingly relaxed like he hadn't a care in the world. I froze when I noticed Richard at the kitchen table, hunched over his laptop, typing furiously, blissfully unaware of the charged atmosphere, oblivious to Ethan's lingering gaze on me. As I grabbed a mug from the cabinet, my hands trembling slightly, Ethan spoke, his tone casual, but the slight smirk curling at the corner of his lips said otherwise. "Morning, Claire," he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. "Good morning," I replied, not daring to meet his eyes, my voice tight, strained. Richard glanced up briefly, his brow furrowed with concentration. "I'll be working late tonight," he muttered, more to himself than to us, his attention already drifting back to the glowing screen. "That damn audit is taking up all my time." Ethan didn't miss the opportunity. "Guess it'll just be the two of us then," he said, his voice deceptively light, a dangerous undercurrent running beneath the surface. I shot him a warning glare, a silent plea for him to stop, to back down, to not push it. But he ignored it, taking another sip of coffee, his eyes locked on mine, a silent challenge as if to say, "What are you going to do about it?" Richard, thankfully, didn't notice. He was already buried in his work again, completely oblivious to the undercurrent of desire and danger that had taken over the room. Later that night, with Richard still at the office, Ethan knocked softly on my bedroom door. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every rational part of me screamed to keep it locked, to send him away to pretend he wasn't there. But when I opened it, just a crack, the sight of him, his tousled dark hair, his piercing blue eyes, the raw vulnerability in his gaze, left me defenseless. "We shouldn't," I whispered, my voice barely audible, as he stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, sealing us in our secret, dangerous world. "We shouldn't," he agreed, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm against my skin. But the way his hand brushed against my arm, the way his eyes held mine captive, told me he had no intention of stopping. Our relationship spiraled deeper into dangerous territory, a tangled web of stolen moments and reckless desires. We found excuses to be alone, each encounter feeling riskier, more intoxicating than the last. One night, we drove to a secluded park on the outskirts of the city, parking under the dense canopy of trees, the moonlight filtering through the branches, casting shadows that felt like a protective cloak around us. "Do you ever think about how this ends?" I asked him, my voice barely a whisper, as we sat in the car, the silence of the woods pressing in around us, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within me. He turned to me, his expression serious, the playful facade finally stripped away, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. "Do you want it to end?" he asked, his voice low, searching. I didn't have an answer, not yet. But life, as it often does, had a way of forcing answers out of you, whether you were ready for them or not. One evening, as I worked late in my home office, trying to meet a looming deadline, Tiffany arrived unannounced. She'd been coming around more often in recent weeks, her visits becoming increasingly frequent, her presence a constant, unsettling reminder of the precariousness of our secret. And while Ethan claimed she was harmless, just a clingy ex, I could see the sharp edge behind her carefully crafted smiles, the calculating glint in her eyes. "Hey, Claire," she said, leaning against the doorframe, her voice dripping with false sweetness, her gaze too intense, too probing. "Is Ethan around?" I looked up from my desk, trying to keep my expression neutral, to mask the sudden jolt of panic that shot through me. "I think he, went out running errands," I stammered, my voice betraying my unease. "Did you need something?" She shrugged, stepping fully into the room without an invitation, her eyes scanning my office, taking in every detail, every carefully curated object. "Not really," she purred, her gaze settling on me, studying me like I was a puzzle she was determined to solve. "I just wanted to chat, get to know you better." I forced a smile, a tight, strained smile that felt more like a grimace. "Well, I'm always happy to chat," I said, my voice steady, but tight. "What's on your mind, Tiffany?" Tiffany tilted her head, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulder, her blue eyes narrowed, assessing. "You've been married to Richard for, 2 years now?" "That's right," I said, keeping my tone light, casual, hoping to deflect her probing questions. "And Ethan," she continued, her words carefully measured, each syllable dripping with insinuation, "he seems pretty comfortable around you." The comment hit too close to home, a direct shot to the heart of my carefully guarded secret, and I had to fight to maintain my composure, to keep my face neutral. "Ethan's a great kid," I said, my voice steady, but my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Tiffany smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was a cold, knowing smile, a predator's smile. "Kid, right?" she echoed, her voice laced with skepticism, her gaze unwavering, dissecting me. I didn't know how much she knew, how much she suspected, but the conversation left me rattled, deeply unsettled. The pressure intensified, closing in on me from all sides. And then Roger Sterling, my overly flirtatious client, started crossing even more boundaries, his pursuit becoming more aggressive, more insistent. He began calling at odd hours, his tone becoming less professional with each conversation, more suggestive, more demanding. At first, I brushed it off, dismissing it as harmless ego stroking, the unwanted attention of a wealthy, entitled man. But one day, he showed up at the apartment unannounced, a bottle of expensive wine in hand, his smile too wide, too confident. "Thought we could go over the project details," he said, his eyes glinting with something that was definitely not professional interest. Richard was out, thankfully, and Ethan was upstairs, hopefully out of sight, out of earshot. I reluctantly let Roger in, trying to keep the visit brief, to steer the conversation back to business, to maintain some semblance of professional distance. But he lingered, making no move to leave, sitting too close on the couch, his arm draped casually along the back, his hand dangerously close to my shoulder. As he flipped through my portfolio, his gaze more focused on me than on the design plans. "You've got a real talent, Claire," he murmured, his voice low and suggestive, his hand grazing mine, a deliberate, possessive touch. "But you know that already, don't you?" I stood abruptly, pulling my hand away, creating space, putting an end to the charade. "Thank you, Roger," I said firmly, my voice leaving no room for argument. "But I think we've gone over everything we need to for today." His smile faltered, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger flashing across his face. But he didn't argue. He knew when he'd pushed too far, when he'd reached the limit of my tolerance. As he left, I watched from the window, my stomach churning with a sickening mix of fear and disgust. I had a sinking feeling that Roger Sterling wasn't the type to take rejection lightly, especially not from someone he considered beneath him. The breaking point, the moment everything shattered, came just 2 weeks later. Richard had planned a small gathering at the apartment, a seemingly innocuous celebration of a recent business deal, a casual evening with close friends and colleagues. It was supposed to be a relaxed, low-key affair, but the atmosphere, from the moment the first guest arrived, was anything but relaxed. Roger Sterling was there, of course, his gaze following me around the room like a predator watching its prey, his presence a constant, unsettling reminder of his unwanted advances. And Tiffany, to my utter dismay, had also shown up, uninvited, but with a reason to stay, a reason that twisted the knife even deeper. She claimed, with a smug smile that sent a chill down my spine, that she was Ethan's date. I avoided both of them as best I could, circulating through the room, playing the perfect hostess, laughing at forced jokes, refilling glasses, trying to project an image of normalcy, of control. But the evening felt like walking a tightrope, high above a chasm of secrets and lies. Every lingering glance from Roger, every knowing smirk from Tiffany, made the walls feel like they were closing in, suffocating me. At one point, I caught Tiffany cornering Ethan in the hallway, their voices low, intense. I couldn't hear their conversation, but her body language was aggressive, her gestures sharp and pointed, her eyes flashing with anger. Ethan looked outwardly calm, his expression carefully neutral, but his jaw was tight, a telltale sign that he was holding back, barely containing his own anger. Later, as the party wound down, the guests trickling out one by one, leaving behind a trail of empty glasses and forced smiles, I found myself alone in the kitchen, rinsing glasses, trying to steady my frayed nerves, to regain some semblance of composure. That's when Tiffany appeared, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, her presence filling the small space, suffocating me. "You're good at this," she said, her voice low, venomous, leaning against the counter, her eyes narrowed, dissecting, playing the perfect wife, the perfect stepmother. I froze, the glass in my hand slipping slightly under the running water, the cold shock a welcome distraction from the dread that washed over me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Oh, I think you do," she said, her voice dripping with venom, her smile cold, predatory. The look in her eyes sent a chill down my spine, a cold, stark realization. She knew everything. Before I could respond, before I could deny it, before I could even form a coherent thought, Ethan entered the kitchen, his expression dark, his eyes narrowed, his body language radiating protectiveness, anger. "Tiffany, let it go," he said firmly, his voice a low growl, a silent warning. She smirked, pushing off the counter, her eyes still locked on mine, a silent promise of retribution hanging in the air between us. "Sure," she said, her voice laced with false sweetness. "For now." And just like that, she was gone, leaving me standing in the kitchen, trembling, my world crumbling around me, the pieces falling into place with terrifying clarity. Tiffany didn't go to Richard, not immediately, but the damage was done. Knowing she held our secret over my head, like a sword poised to strike, was unbearable, a constant, suffocating weight. Every time she came over, every time she glanced at me with that smug, knowing smile, every time she spoke to Ethan, her voice dripping with possessiveness, I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped in a cage of my own making. Ethan tried to reassure me, insisting Tiffany wouldn't dare expose us, that she was just trying to be manipulative, to regain control. But I wasn't so sure. Tiffany had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. And she wasn't the only threat looming on the horizon. Richard, bless his oblivious heart, was growing more suspicious by the day, his questions more pointed, his demeanor colder, more distant. Then the final blow came, swift and brutal, from an unexpected source. One evening, as I sat in the living room, pretending to read a magazine, trying desperately to maintain the illusion that everything was fine, Richard burst through the front door, his face flushed with anger, his eyes blazing with fury. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, controlled, but vibrating with barely suppressed rage. I froze, my heart sinking like a stone in my chest. "What is it?" He threw a stack of papers onto the coffee table, scattering them like fallen leaves. Bank statements, credit card transactions, financial documents I didn't recognize. "You've been siphoning money from our joint account," he accused, his voice shaking with rage, his eyes accusing, unforgiving. "What?" I gasped, grabbing the papers, my hands trembling as I scanned the unfamiliar transactions, the large sums withdrawn, the dates, the details. "I haven't," I protested, my voice rising in disbelief, in panic. "Don't lie to me, Claire," he snapped, his voice sharp, cutting. "There are thousands missing. Do you think I wouldn't notice?" I stared at the statements, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand. I hadn't touched the account. I hadn't authorized any of these transactions. But the evidence was damning, irrefutable. And then, like a lightning bolt, it hit me. Roger Sterling. Roger had been flirting with me, pursuing me relentlessly for weeks. And I'd brushed it off as harmless, dismissive, arrogant male ego. But now, with terrifying clarity, I realized he must have gained access to my financial information somehow, likely through our work together on his penthouse renovation project. He had access to everything. "I didn't take the money," I said firmly, meeting Richard's glare, my voice shaking but resolute. He scoffed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "Then who did?" "Because it didn't disappear on its own." The argument escalated, our voices rising, the accusations flying back and forth, the carefully constructed facade of our marriage crumbling into dust, until Ethan appeared, drawn by the commotion, his eyes darting between us, his expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice cautious, hesitant. "Stay out of this, Ethan," Richard snapped, his anger momentarily shifting, focusing on his son. But Ethan didn't back down. He stepped between us, a silent buffer, his protective instincts kicking in, his presence inadvertently fueling Richard's simmering suspicions. And that's when Richard's carefully controlled anger finally boiled over, erupting in a torrent of accusations, of unspoken resentments. "What are you even doing here?" he demanded, his voice dripping with contempt, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "You're always around, hovering. It's like you don't have a life of your own." Ethan's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Maybe I just care about what happens in this house," he retorted, his voice low, dangerous. Richard laughed bitterly, a harsh, humorless sound. "Or maybe you've got something to hide, just like her." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air, unspoken accusations, veiled suspicions. For a moment, a terrifying, breathless moment, I thought he might say it. Might accuse us outright, expose our secret, shatter everything, but instead he turned abruptly and stormed out of the living room, slamming the door behind him, leaving Ethan and me standing there in the shattered remains of our carefully constructed lives, the unspoken truth hanging heavy between us. The fallout was inevitable, swift and brutal. Richard filed for divorce a week later, citing irreconcilable differences, the financial discrepancies, the irreparable damage to our marriage. He never found out about Ethan and me, or if he did, he never said a word, never acknowledged the deeper betrayal, the more devastating secret. But the damage was done, irreparable. Tiffany, true to her word, kept quiet. For now. Though not out of kindness, not out of any sense of loyalty, she'd made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that her silence came with a price. Ethan was hers now, or so she thought. Ethan, however, had other plans. He left town shortly after the divorce was finalized, disappearing as suddenly and completely as he had entered my life, leaving behind a note, crumpled and hastily written, that was equal parts apology and confession. "I love you," it read, the words stark and raw on the cheap motel stationery, "but this can't go on, not like this." I couldn't blame him. What we had, whatever it was never meant to last. It was a dangerous spark, a forbidden flame destined to burn out as quickly as it ignited, and deep down, I'd always known it. In the months that followed, I tried, slowly, painstakingly, to rebuild my life, to pick up the shattered pieces and create something new, something different. I moved into a small, anonymous apartment downtown, far from the sprawling brownstone I'd once shared with Richard, far from the ghosts of our fractured past. I threw myself into my work, burying myself in projects, in deadlines, in the relentless demands of my career. The scandal with Roger Sterling eventually came to light. The truth about the stolen money, the fraudulent transactions, finally revealed. And while it cleared my name, exonerating me from Richard's accusations, it did little to erase the deeper damage, the emotional wreckage. As for Ethan, I heard whispers of him now and then, fragments of information gleaned from mutual acquaintances, from social media whispers. A new job in another city, a fleeting relationship with someone his own age, a life moving on, evolving without me. But he never reached out, and neither did I. Sometimes, late at night, when the city lights blurred through my apartment window, when the silence of the city pressed in around me, I'd find myself thinking about him, about Ethan, about the choices we'd made, the lines we'd crossed, the forbidden desires that had consumed us and ultimately destroyed us. I didn't regret the way he made me feel, alive, desired, seen, but I couldn't deny the cost, the devastating, irreversible cost. Sitting alone in my newly decorated living room, the minimalist furniture and neutral tones a stark contrast to the opulent excess of my former life, I sipped a glass of cheap wine, the bitter taste mirroring the bitterness in my heart, and stared out the window at the relentless, indifferent pulse of the city. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the storm I'd weathered, the wreckage I'd survived. I'd lost everything. My marriage, my home, my carefully constructed sense of stability. But I'd also gained something unexpected, something forged in the fires of scandal and heartbreak, clarity. Sometimes, I realize, staring out at the endless expanse of city lights, the things that break us are the very same things that set us free.